All right, so the State of the Union address, it happens every year. But what we're talking about today isn't the speech itself. Nope, we're diving into the reaction to it from one of the internet's biggest streamers, a reaction that absolutely went viral.
And yeah, that was the title of the video that millions of people watched. It tells you right away this was going to be a raw, unfiltered take on a major political event. So we're going to unpack exactly what he had to say.
Look, we've gone through the hours and hours of commentary so you don't have to, and we've pulled out all the key arguments and the main themes. So what was the core message he was trying to get across to his massive audience?
Okay, so the streamer's entire take really hinges on this one central idea, that the public debate that we all see, it's just a distraction. He's arguing that there's a completely different game being played behind the scenes.
This one quote, this is pretty much the key to his entire argument. The idea is that the whole conversation about immigration is just a misdirection, a smokescreen for a much deeper and more strategic goal.
And he breaks this whole theory down into what he sees as a three-step strategy. Step 1 is to import. Step 2 is to activate that new demographic as a reliable voting bloc. And then, Step 3, you use that bloc to force your policies through. So in his view, immigration is basically just the Trojan horse for a much larger political objective.
So to try and prove his point, the streamer then zeroed in on how politicians frame their arguments. He used the tragic case of Irene Zarusa as what he sees as a prime example of this kind of deliberate distraction.
He claims that his opponents, they always go for what he calls the easy dunk, focusing on small factual errors to score points. But in doing that, they distract from what he calls the real conversation. And in this specific case, the real conversation was about the perpetrator's extensive criminal history, even though he was a U.S. citizen.
And to back this up, he actually looked it up live on stream. A quick search, and bam! It turns out the individual had been arrested 14 times before for all sorts of things, from misdemeanors all the way up to felonies like armed robbery and assault.
And this is what brought him to his crucial point. He believes the real story wasn't about semantics or immigration status, but about a justice system that, in his view, had failed again and again and again.
So the commentary then kind of shifted from the policy debates to a really sharp critique of how the politicians themselves were acting during the address. He just found it all deeply unprofessional.
He really didn't hold back on the heckling and interruptions from some members of Congress. He called it third world behavior and compared it to something you might see in a chaotic parliament, not in Washington, D.C.
He called one moment in particular a complete fumble. He argued that from his perspective, all the politicians had to do was just stand up and show they represented the American people.
But he didn't just stop at criticizing, right? The streamer then spent a pretty significant amount of time laying out his own, often very unconventional solutions for his audience.
So, let's take his proposal for mandatory prison labor. He argues it actually serves a dual purpose. On the one hand, taxpayers benefit financially, and on the other, prisoners learn real skills that he thinks could reduce crime and help them succeed once they're released.
He also hit on some other big hot-button issues. For instance, he demanded mandatory voter ID, arguing the only reason to oppose it is if you want to cheat. And he also presented what he sees as a very hard choice. You can have social safety nets, or you can have open immigration, but you can't have both.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the streamer's reaction video wasn't just some random rant. It really presented a distinct, coherent worldview to a massive, and I mean massive, online audience.
So he really boiled down these complex political events into a few core themes. First, it's all about a demographic strategy, not an immigration debate. Second, political arguments are missing the real conversation. Third, political conduct has become performative and embarrassing. And finally, the solutions he proposes are often radical and provocative.
And this all leaves us with a final thought, a pretty big question actually. As streamers become these huge political commentators, reaching millions of people directly and unfiltered, how does that change the way we all understand politics? It's definitely reshaping the landscape in ways we're probably only just beginning to comprehend.